Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Welcome to the Brain People Podcast. I'm Amanda Anguish, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm also a woman. And I'm here with my co-host,
Dr. Daniel Binus, and I'm a psychiatrist, and yes, I am a man.
Today we're talking about the differences between men and women, and we will try to answer all your questions, but we may not get to all of them. We're going to talk about this today. This is a bold adventure that we're about to go on.
That's right. And don't worry, it's going to be kosher. We're not going to do anything too crazy, I think.
Oh, don't tell them that. Maybe they'll listen through the whole time.
True.
Yeah, you have no idea what we're going to cover today. So, whatever made you think up this topic?
You know, I think it's a fascinating topic, and I've thought that for a long time, especially ever since I've been married. I realized, wow, there are a lot of differences between, the way that men think and behave, the way that women think and behave. And of course, there's countless jokes and memes out there about, well, we were even talking about it before the podcast, like how do you discover the mind of a woman? And there's a book written on that, and it's like, this thick, and then how do you figure out a man? And there's like a piece of paper. It's like,
and one line on it.
One line on it. And so it's just interesting that, our society as a whole, I think virtually forever has recognized there are real differences. Now, of course, in our culture, we think a lot more along the lines of a spectrum of like maleness or femaleness and that sort of thing. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind that there are real differences there, and there's reasons for those differences, not just physically, but also in our minds. And so I'm fascinated. I'm always interested, like, well, why are those differences there? Because I think if we understand those differences, it helps us to understand each other better, and in turn, it hopefully helps us to get along a little bit better, at least have a little more empathy and understanding for one another, which is, I think, a good thing.
I love this topic. I was a little fearful when you brought it up that we'd talk about it, because I was like, wow, which direction are we going to go? There's so many different things that we can do. But I think it's really cool to understand these things. It's, if you went into battle, you'd want to know who your opponent was and as much about them as you possibly could know. But we don't have to go to battle with
Good. I was like, oh, well, yeah, okay, battle.
We don't have to go to battle with our opponent, but it helps that much more to understand each other when we know about each other too. So we were talking beforehand, but maybe you could start with some of the in utero things. Let's start just even before the baby is born, even before, they're out of the womb and we know which gender they are maybe. Well, I guess we can know before that too, but let's start with what are some of the differences in utero that we find?
Yeah, so, the basic understanding of the difference between male and female really boils down to biology, meaning what we technically define as a male has one X chromosome and one Y chromosome. And then as a female has two X chromosomes. Okay, so that is the underlying basic biological cellular difference. And you'd think, well, what's the big deal? How could that make such a huge difference? But it makes a huge difference. And so, and the question becomes like, why? And the biggest answer to that boils down to the effect of hormones even early on in life, meaning even in utero. And so what we find is that there are distinct and important effects that testosterone starts to have on the developing fetus. And it's fascinating. And, I'm not an expert in this area, but just to start looking a little bit at how that starts affecting, of course, not only the reproductive organs, but again, my interest and focus as a psychiatrist is especially how that little bit of testosterone, because it's not a lot more, for the male baby versus the female baby, but just a little bit more, how this already is critical to the development of the brain. So even when we talk about weeks 12 through 19 of gestation, we're starting to see some of that impact. And essentially, what we see is that little bit of testosterone affects the organization of the brain, especially related to social intelligence, which is kind of interesting. And one of the things that we find is that that little bit of testosterone, what do you think? Does it help males' social intelligence or does it potentially hinder?
Well, I think I already know the answer because we talked about it before.
And would you have guessed the correct answer if we had not talked about it?
I would have been clueless probably how it affected them. I mean, I know a little bit of the differences between men and women socially, so maybe a little less, or it helps them less with socialization.
Yes, and that's actually what we see. And I think Amanda there, do you see how carefully she was trying to be very objective, trying to take a step back? Um, Yeah, this is actually a typical response to for a woman who has high emotional intelligence and is like, they're wanting the other people to feel comfortable and good, and they don't want to like cause social rifts, right?
Oh,
And
okay.
so this is a good example. Whereas me, I might just be like, yeah, especially if I was a woman, yeah, definitely. Men are less socially intelligent.
Yeah.
But the truth is that is actually the case. As a whole, men tend to be less socially intelligent. And what we find is there's even an interesting
I'm
theory.
guessing there's a reason for that, though. We both come from a Christian worldview, so I'm guessing that women being more socially intelligent and men being less, there's probably a purpose in being slightly less versus just, oh, sorry guys, you're messed up because you don't have all that social awareness.
Well, and that's a good point because when we think about that whole aspect of being socially intelligent, what research usually defines or relates to social intelligence is the ability to empathize and connect that way. And what we don't always think about is that, typically, yes, empathy is a very positive, good attribute. But, you could argue that there might even be downsides at times. Because if I'm over empathizing, it might be hard for me to make some tough decisions or even maybe like disciplining.
Quick decisions too,
Quick
getting
decisions,
something
right?
done that needs
Yeah.
to be done fast.
So even though there's that element of like, okay, social intelligence, it doesn't mean that it's always a disadvantage. And this is what we're going to see, I think, as we kind of go throughout our podcast, is that men and women, the strengths and the weaknesses, quote unquote, are very complementary, actually, and we need each other. It's not that one is better than the other; it's that we need both to balance each other out in society, in our social circles, in the family, and that is the ideal.
This is so cool to me. I love this because as you're saying that, I'm thinking, you know, what if God wanted us to have to slow down a bit and be considerate of another because of each of these qualities, good, bad, slower, faster, whatever, because he wanted us to learn to work together and be unified, even despite qualities being slightly more this way or that way, because it's also a reflection of how he works with the Holy Spirit and with Jesus, and that this is, I always think of like marriage is women and men are different, and it's a way to teach us how to work together and be considerate, not just the social way, but also to slow down or speed up in certain areas where we might not normally do that. And that's the lesson for me in the marriage to
One of my friends often says, marriage is for salvation, and what he means by that is, those differences that can sometimes be, oh, so frustrating are the very things that actually can help us to learn to have patience and to grow as people. And those tension points, even though they're difficult, are also opportunities for great growth.
Yeah, and selflessness, because that's the
Yes.
key to the kingdom is selflessness.
Absolutely. So it's interesting too. There's even an androgen theory of autism. Part of this theory actually posits that perhaps certain individuals, maybe not all, are exposed to too much testosterone on some levels, or it affects them more than the average individual fetus in utero, and that in turn really shuts down their ability to develop that healthy social cognition and at least a certain degree of empathy, right? And so um, there is that correlation which we see, and we also actually do see a higher proportion of males that have autism. So this is something that's a theory and it's not proven, but it's just kind of an interesting sidebar when we're talking about even the effect of testosterone on the brain's development in utero.
Is there anything that shows up more in girls or women after in utero because of more estrogen production?
Yeah, so when we think about that, and we'll talk a little more about estrogen here in a little bit, but estrogen really has a big effect on mood. It does also affect socialization. It affects even levels of serotonin, and so all of those things are tied with estrogen levels as well. But I wanted to just mention a few other things where we think about the effect of testosterone. Of course, physically, testosterone helps men to typically have more muscle strength, more higher bone density, more red blood cell production. Uh, it also is going to be responsible for male hair patterns, male pattern baldness, for example, voice deepening, growth spurts during puberty, and also even fat distribution. You've probably noticed that women tend to have more fat around the like the hips and the buttocks area. We call that kind of the pear-shaped distribution, and then men tend to have more of the central around their belly, and so they're more of like the apple sort of distribution, and so even testosterone affects that. Testosterone also affects the stress response. So if we have adequate levels of testosterone as males and even as females, because females do have some testosterone.
I think that's key because oftentimes we think that, oh, women are all estrogen and men are all testosterone, but we don't realize we actually share a lot of hormones too. We just don't share them at the same levels that the opposite sex does.
Exactly. Yes. And so those are, of course, some of the physical things. But when we look at there's psychological aspects as well, which is really interesting. And again, we want to have testosterone for men and women, the right levels, because you can get too much or too little. So if you have too little, that's one of the common things that I check with my male depressed patients. That can lead to depression, actually. Because testosterone is one of the big things that it develops in boys and also in men is this motivational drive and this desire in a way to compete and to conquer and this sort of thing. And most most of us can recognize the differences even in the way that girls and boys play. Have you ever noticed some of those differences?
I have. I have. And you have kids of both, types that you can see the difference in the way they play too, I'm sure.
So what would you say is quintessential to when you see boys playing versus girls playing?
Well, definitely girls are more conscientious of each other. They're playing with the dolls and nurturing and that sort of thing. And they're more communicative too. So the dolls are talking to each other or they're talking to each other as they play. Boys tend to be less verbal in terms of sentences, but sounds maybe. And then tend to be a little more rambunctious and I would say probably destructive too.
Yes. And so we see even early on, I mean, I didn't need to tell my boy to be interested in trucks and in sword fighting and all these things that are very competitive in nature and more of like, oh, yeah, let's, go out and conquer something or, hear some big noises and that sort of thing. And it's not that my daughter is completely averse to those things, but you can see that she's drawn a lot more to like dolls and to, that's those social connections versus more the physical and hands-on and that sort of thing. And so, and again, we never told our kids, no, we never told my son, you can't play with dolls. And we never told my daughter, you need to play with dolls or whatever. It's interesting to watch, even early on, the natural draw towards one direction or another. And a lot of people say, well, it's kind of it's a social construct, right? It's the environmental influence. But there's a very innate process due to those minor hormone levels, even in childhood.
Well, and I know your youngest, your daughter, she is right behind your son. So, in fact, the cultural predisposition should be to play with the things that he plays with because that's what she saw growing up.
That's right. Yeah, and she does do some of that. Like I said, she's not averse to that, but you can just see that she's also very interested in more of some of the social connection and the dolls, and even the way that she connects with people is going to be different than my son. So, yeah, the right levels, again, are related to mood. Higher levels of testosterone can actually lead to aggression. And that's, the right level is good because you have motivation. It helps you give energy. It helps you stay focused on your task. Like I want to, the conquerors, right? I always wonder, like, how much testosterone did like Alexander the Great have, or any of these guys? But the right amount is key.
And I wonder too, as we're talking about this, some things I hear, in society too, you know, is this what we attribute toxic masculinity to, or is that a cultural learned behavior that they get from whatever environment that they're in? Because I would imagine that, well, I know not all men are destructive. Maybe they're more inclined to be, they like to destroy and build and conquer and that sort of thing, but it doesn't mean they all act it out in the same exact way. So it's not just testosterone that makes somebody toxic, it's other things on top of that that makes them toxic.
It's which kind of dysregulates the effects of testosterone where it goes wild, right? And that's a very good point because when we think about the differences between men and women, and I think a lot of people have said like, oh, we've been living in this male-dominated society and the chauvinism and all of this, and I think that has kind of come on as part of the backlash for people who have been in positions of power and have then yielded to the temptation to abuse that power. And I think what we need to realize is, even if men, because of that testosterone, have a higher likelihood of kind of being in the leadership positions because they are going to be like more motivated to be, quote unquote, domineering or leaders or whatever. God has actually given that to be a blessing and to be a protective element for a community or a family, that sort of thing, rather than a curse. But again, because of the misuse and the abuse that men have, now it's like, oh, it's almost like a negative thing to have like masculine traits. But those things can be a great blessing, I think.
I think of that too, with women. Both aspects of that is that, God gives us these qualities, but it's also our job to rein them or to have self-control over how we utilize them. Because I can think of, as a woman, I may be more prone to have an emotional response to a trigger. And what do I do with that? Do I let that go to the nth degree because I'm feeling emotional about it? Or do I also rein that in and check my thinking and recognize where those feelings are coming from versus just acting on them every chance I get?
Absolutely. And those can be it's like that double-edged sword of testosterone, right? So with estrogen and progesterone, there's being dominant in that area, of course, women are going to have better social cognition. They're going to be more in touch with their feelings. By the way, a big part of that being in touch with their feelings better is because women, the left and the right brain actually talks to each other a lot more. In other words, there's greater connectivity between the two hemispheres in a woman, and we know that your brain, the right side is more dominant emotionally, the left side is more logical. And so when you have that connection, it can be a huge blessing because you can have more intuition, right? And my wife is like, she'll feel things about people or about situations like, ooh, I don't. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I don't see anything that is like scary or, warning signs or there's nothing logical here. But she's like, but I get a weird feeling. I'm like,
Yeah.
what is that supposed to mean, right?
What is that feeling that estrogen brings to you that I don't get?
But so often she's right, and I'm like, whoa,
Yeah.
And so, like you said, it can be a great blessing, but it can also be a toxic thing if you just allow your emotions to take you all over the place. Or, let's say you have that intuition, but you never really stop to check it against reality.
Yeah.
What do you think? Can our intuition be wrong?
Yes, it can be. And often is.
Yeah. And
Especially if we've had past experiences to heighten that
that's
response
true.
too.
Yeah. And sometimes we can then, because of our past, like whether it's traumas or negative experiences, then, be maybe overprotective or to just mislabel people incorrectly or judge them incorrectly just because they remind us
Yeah.
intuitively of someone else or
Over emotional reasoning.
exactly. But again, there can be so much of the positive. And that's where we see that beautiful balance, I think, between men and women again. Like maybe the woman is intuitive, she brings things to the man's attention that need to be paid that he would have otherwise ignored. And then the man can often be like, okay, well, wait, let's take a step back and see if this is really rooted in reality, right?
That's so interesting because even in a perfect environment like Eden, God gave Adam Eve as a helpmate. So this isn't all after the fall
No.
kind of stuff. This is God made us this way. Obviously, the fall has had an effect on us, but it's still intrinsic to us.
Yeah. I mean, she was given as his helpmate. So he needed help even before the fall because again, man by himself is actually not complete. And that's where when God said, "Hey, let's create humankind in our image," it says male and female, he made them. So the true reflection of who God is not seen in a man by himself or a woman by herself, but in the two together, unified, complementing each other.
The ideal situation. And that doesn't mean that if you're single and you're not connected to another person or married, that you're not a whole person. It just means there's so much more that we learn about ourselves and the other when we are in that situation.
Absolutely. And I would even go as far as to say, of course, always have good boundaries with the opposite sex, but like let's say in social situations, and in work situations, again, good boundaries, when you're not married, but there can still be that beautiful complementary sort of experience that you can have, which can be powerful. And like, let's say you're at church and doing ministry together. I mean, that's a wonderful way to actually really exercise, the best of both worlds. So yeah, let's talk just a little bit about estrogen. I mean, we mentioned it earlier, but one of the interesting things about estrogen and progesterone is that they fluctuate. And so what we see, is that through the life cycle, especially when women are in the reproductive years, there's significant fluctuations generally every month of estrogen and progesterone. And so that estrogen and that progesterone affects the levels of neurotransmitters, especially like serotonin, for example. And because it fluctuates, this is what gives rise to even things like PMS, especially PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, which is like a severe form of PMS. When that estrogen drops off, that's where a lot of those premenstrual symptoms can come up because, again, the hypothesis is that it affects the serotonin levels, and that really affects a female's moods.
And I know we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but I want those who, suffer from some of these things to know that there's a lot of lifestyle things that they can do to regulate those.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Diet is a big one, and
Absolutely. And so, it's important to understand that i- lower estrogen levels, whether it's the second half of the cycle or even just in general, can actually predispose to things like depression. It can actually make it more difficult for women to regulate stress and the trauma response. So they're going to be more vulnerable. Like if they experience a trauma when they're lower on estrogen, it's harder for them to actually cope with trauma versus if their estrogen levels were higher.
is that considered in psychiatry then to regulate the estrogen levels? Do a lot of people know about this and incorporate that
I think
into?
it's becoming a little more well known, and what I will say is certainly when a lot of women are going through perimenopause and into menopause, that a lot of women really will start struggling with the sleep patterns and more mood issues. Sometimes it's higher anxiety, sometimes it's more depression, and so a lot of times I will strongly encourage them to go see their gynecologist to get their hormone levels checked, and then, if it's appropriate, to consider even doing some hormonal replacement therapy. And I know there's risks involved, so you have to make that decision with your doctor. But a lot of times the benefits far outweigh the risks. And this can help significantly then, with mental health outcomes.
Yeah, and I know not everybody feels comfortable with, I know a lot of women who try to do things naturally and even in terms of hormones, menopause, that sort of thing. And so there are a lot of options out there. It's not just medication.
Right.
So I want everybody to know, like, don't freak out if you think, oh, the only way I can get better is medication. No, there's a lot of lifestyle stuff and supplements and things like that that you can do as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. Progesterone actually does also play a role because we often think just almost exclusively about estrogen, but progesterone is metabolized to pregnenolone, and that actually has a calming effect on the nervous system. And so, if progesterone levels are too high, that could potentially, especially if it was like outside of pregnancy, that could potentially lead to some mood issues. But if it's too low, it also could contribute to things like insomnia and potentially, for some women, increased anxiety because again, it has more of a calming effect on the nervous system. So the balance is very important.
Which other mental issues do people deal with more so because they're female versus more so because they're male besides just the
Yeah, there's a lot of course, there's the PMDD, but we know that women definitely tend statistically to struggle more with things like depression and anxiety disorders and PTSD and all of this. And again, a lot of people hypothesize because that it's related to the fluctuations, the hormonal fluctuations, and that's not always easy for the brain to deal with, especially if you're maybe traumatized, like when your estrogen levels were lower and whatnot. So there is a higher likelihood, and it seems related to the hormonal fluctuations that women will develop mental health
Yeah,
problems.
I'm thinking as you're saying that there's probably somebody out there who might be struggling with that statement because they might be thinking, well, what if it's just women are more in touch with what they're feeling and so they go and seek help versus a man might be struggling out there but because he's not as in touch with his emotions, he's, acting out, lashing out, doing some kind of addictive behavior because he doesn't recognize that he has depression or anxiety. Do you think that plays a part in that as well?
I think it could at times, but even that we would say is kind of related to some of those differences, you know? So you could probably argue it both ways because of that heightened connectivity in the brain. But, you know, by definition, of course, depression typically has to do with, you know, really feeling down and depressed and having low motivation and all these symptoms that we classically. So you could kind of argue it either way, but I think, you know, point well taken. I think that women, because they are more in touch with their feelings, they might realize earlier on when they are actually having a mental health struggle. But we know even beyond the awareness that the rates really are higher, you know, in women.
Either that or have a symptomology for women and symptomology for men, like a man depression versus a woman depression, just like man flu versus women flu.
Yes.
Have you heard that?
Yeah. Man flu versus woman flu. Yeah. Okay. I haven't heard that one.
No, women are still, you know, up and doing everything where men are, oh, I can't get up. I'm so sick. You know, the women tend to handle sickness better. They get up and go versus men who really just relish in the suffering of the illness.
You know, and that's an interesting point. And I can't say that I can give the exact reason for all of that, except for maybe men, you know, are typically so driven when they have something go wrong. They're like, I might almost be like, oh, finally, I can just be a baby again, which is really deep down what I want.
Yes.
All of this like maleness was such a facade. I just want to be taken care of.
Or maybe the sickness decreases the testosterone or something. I don't know.
Yeah. So brain size and the composition, men actually do have larger skulls and more white matter, but women have more gray matter.
Does our audience know the difference between what gray matter and white matter does?
The gray matter is actually the cell bodies, and the white matter is the myelination. But it's kind of interesting because it almost, there's other research that shows that women actually might, or men actually might use more of the gray matter that they have. So, you know, again, some of these things are kind of interesting, but how much it really boils down to having great meaning. Other differences include the inferior parietal lobe is larger in men. This is helpful for solving math problems, judging speed, estimating time. Okay, and I don't know why
I'm my husband's better at managing time than I am.
I was going to say, though, I don't know why I'm still always late to this. So maybe that part of my parietal lobe's not working so well. And we already talked about the social learning, the estrogen being really important. And then, you know, again, those connections within the brain and the brain processing patterns. Interestingly, of course, we talked about, you know, the left to right being more in the females, but the front to back is more in males.
Oh, okay.
Which again is kind of interesting. Males tend to have better spatial abilities and motor skills, and females have superior memory and the social aspect, like we
remember
talked
that,
before.
ladies. We have superior memory. Don't abuse it.
So again, I think, you know, the underlying thing that I want to emphasize in this podcast is to realize, like, yes, there are differences, and certainly there's, you know, a spectrum within maleness and within femaleness. Like, you know, you have some women that are that quintessential, like, female, quote unquote, like, you know, that motherly role, and they're just like, I'm born to be a mom. And other women, they're like, no, I need to be like out working, and right. And then, you know, some males that are like the strong leader type and that are the boss and all of this, and then others that are like, you know what, I enjoy just like, you know, like I think of Jacob and Esau, right? Like Jacob was happy at home, like cooking and kind of hanging out with his mom, and Esau was out there like hunting and doing all these male things, right? So, you know, there are differences even within maleness and femaleness, but there are distinct differences between both.
And that leads me to, you know, I don't think we've talked about this yet, but as we get older, women lose some of that estrogen and men lose some of their testosterone. So it's almost like the reward for getting to that point, especially if you're married, you're like, oh, we're so much more alike now than we were when we started out. It's like, woohoo, we arrived.
One thing that people often realize is that they actually do get along better when that happens. But again, I think a lot of the tumultuous times earlier on in the relationship can be wonderful opportunities to learn and grow character development, right? For salvation, like we said earlier. So don't let that discourage you, but also know that, in the twilight years of the relationship, there's a fondness and a closeness and a lack of as much conflict that can often start taking place, which is beautiful. And I think, again, you get to know each other better, but also, like you said, the hormonal changes start to have an effect, or less of an effect, you might say.
So if you can't handle it, wait until later to get married.
That's right. That's right.
Wait until you're in your 50s to start thinking about marriage.
Yes, that could actually be maybe some positive advice for certain people.
Is that how we should wrap this up?
Well, I think, the way we should probably wrap it up is by saying, even though there are differences, these differences ultimately can be a great blessing.
Yeah.
And we should, instead of just trying to be like, okay, how can we be more the same? I think we can, in a way, celebrate the differences and see how we can collaborate and cooperate rather than, highlighting them in a negative way and trying to make the other person think like me or act like me. It's like, no, how can we learn from each other and really utilize our strengths and also help make up for each other's weaknesses to be a healthier team? Again, whether it's a marriage relationship or other areas in the social realm.
Yeah, and another thing to think about too, is that if you don't quite fit all of these characteristics that we're talking about, maybe you tend to be the more stronger female in the relationship and he's the weaker male or something in the relationship. I hate to say it stronger and weaker, but I hope that you understand our audience, but that you can still work with each other, just being different. Sometimes it feels so hard when, you're like the opposite of me, but how can we utilize those qualities versus fight against them?
Absolutely.
So I guess it's good that God made man and woman.
I think so.
Awesome. Well, we so appreciate this conversation, and I know we had to hold ourselves back a little bit because there's so much more we could talk about, but maybe we'll discover that in another podcast. Thank you for listening. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe. Your engagement will help us reach more people who need encouragement. To hear more episodes, learn about our other mental health resources, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.